Hello and welcome. Hello. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Sorry. Hello and welcome back to the Against the Stream podcast. My name is Hamid Alizadeh and I'm here today with Fred Weston. And we will be going through a series of very interesting developments which have been taking place over the past few weeks in this first episode of Against the Stream of 2025. We'll be discussing the latest situation in Gaza. We'll be discussing the unraveling of Syria, the processes taking place there, the predicament of the Kurdish peoples of Syria. We'll be discussing the crisis of of German capitalism, and finally, we'll be discussing the crisis of liberalism, which is taking place all over the Western world. Now, before we start with the real analyses, we thought that it would be good to remind ourselves of some of the things that have been going on in the past year and which is still going on today. Fred, I know you had some information for us to share.
Yeah, well, this is the first of the new year, and I was thinking, would you start a podcast like this wishing everybody a happy new year? What does happy new year mean in the context of what is happening today? I looked at the news on the first day of this new year, and what strikes me, 22 dead in in Gaza, the attack on the hospital, basically the destruction of the healthcare system in that area, ethnic cleansing continuing in northern Gaza, terrible conditions. I mean, I haven't got time to go into it here. The articles I've read of people living in the tents, the temperature's gone down to 10 degrees or less. You're sleeping out at night in tents, in awful, abominable conditions. What does Happy New Year mean to those people? Or what's happening on the West Bank? The Palestinian Authority sending its security forces into Jenin to attacking basically the armed groups that exist in the West Bank. There's different factions, but the latest I was seeing is that especially the youth of the different factions, they're coming together, they're working together, and they're defending their communities, and they're coming into conflict with the Israeli army. And what does the Palestinian Authority do? Sends in security forces to try and disarm them. And I've got a little snippet here from the US, which is the Americans asking Israel to supply, here's the title, to approve urgent military aid to Palestinian security forces. So the Americans are telling Israel to give guns to the PA so that it can crush the resistance of the Palestinian people in camps like Jenin. And people are being killed, people are being displaced. It continues in the West Bank, this situation, with the Palestinian Authority completely exposed in the eyes of the masses. You read the reports of ordinary people there, and even the mothers of the martyrs, mothers of young men who have been who've died in the fighting, were part of the resistance. So this is ongoing as people are, we're celebrating the fireworks and the New Year and all the rest of it. I'm not against people enjoying themselves. Obviously, everybody has a right to do it, but it is a moment in which you reflect a little bit. I was thinking, how would you start a discussion about the New Year, and how can you not ignore what's happening? How can you ignore, what's happening in northern Gaza and Gaza as a whole, the West Bank, the whole of the Middle East, not to mention the effect it's having in Jordan. I keep reading the reports. They're very worried about what's happening in the West Bank because they're concerned about the destabilizing effects. So this is the ongoing situation in Palestine. So rather than saying Happy New Year, I'd say welcome to this new year. We'll see what is in store for us, but it's going to be economic crisis. It's going to be war. And general malaise that everybody feels in all countries. That's That's what we're facing in the new year.
And I would add to that revolution as well. I think the Middle East, of all places, is one of the ones where you can see the crisis of capitalism in its most concentrated form. In the past year, the rampage of Israel in Gaza and Lebanon and throughout the region has started a domino effect, really, which is spreading like water, destabilizing the whole region. Which brings us to the next point that we wanted to discuss, which is Syria, because one of the consequences of these wars has been the collapse of the Syrian regime. In the place of the old regime, the Assad regime, we've seen the rise of Tahrir al-Sham, this Islamist organization, which even to this day, I believe, is still under British law said to be the same as Al-Qaeda. It's explicitly stated that it should be treated as nothing but Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda with a different name, so to say. And these people are now in power. They've implemented a government. They formed a provisional government, which is, as far as I understand, mainly based a bit, how to say, formed of people brought in from the Idlib governorate, which they ran with a very heavy Islamist hand. And what has been the result of Western powers? Oh, let me just say also, I read today that they changed the school curriculum. So in every reference to the nation is now been changed to references to God. And also there's been some sectarian language inserted there against Christians and against Jews, as well as the removal of certain scientific ideas. So this is the direction things are going. We've seen just before Christmas, the Guardian reported of sectarian attacks against Alawites, against Christians, against Shias. And yet, as I said, the West is treating this regime as, a moderate and reasonable regime. The Americans sent a diplomatic mission to Syria to visit Ahmad al-Shara, or al-Jawlani, which is the original name of the old name of the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And it was, let me just see here, I got it down here, the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, Barbara Leaf. Of course, they're not sending a major diplomat as a but this was a proper delegation, and it was reported in all of the main bourgeois media. And she said that they had a good and thoroughgoing discussion on a range of regional issues, as well as the domestic scene. And what she also did while she was there, she announced that they're removing the bounty on al-Jawlani's head, because at least until just before Christmas, there was a $10 million bounty on this guy's head because he's a well-known Islamic terrorist. This is the same West. It gets tiring of repeating it, but I think we need to repeat it. This is the same Western countries that talk about democracy, Western values, and how the Russians are this and that, and the Iranians are this and that. And then they support probably, the most reactionary force in the region, because that is what these Islamists represent, the most reactionary forces.
Well, Jawlani, he was originally a foreign fighter in the Iraq War. Yes. And then he built up his connections with Al-Qaeda. He became, I'm quoting here, the emir or leader of the Nineveh region in western Iraq for the Islamic State of Iraq. So he was directly involved in ISIS. Now, the last few years, he's been trying to clean up his image a little bit and distance himself and present himself more as a Syrian nationalist as opposed to Islamic State and extreme Islamist. But he may have changed his formal allegiance, to Al Qaeda or ISIS or whatever. But from what you were saying, they haven't changed their general conservative views and the role they play in society. I was reading one analysis which was pointing out that many of those who rose up against the regime in 2011,
Mm.
they were
Yeah.
calling for democracy, openness,
Yes.
rights, freedom. They wanted an end to oppression, and yet what we're getting here is a very conservative regime. They talk about them having cleaned up, but do you remember when the Taliban came back in Afghanistan? They talked about
Oh
they
yeah, they cleaned up.
and they'd improved their image, and they were not like the Taliban of before. Within just 2 or 3 years, they're back to the same kind of things. Girls
Of
can't go
course,
to school, girls can't get an education, people
of
get
course.
checked on the streets.
And these people, we have to add, could not have done all of this without the support of the West.
That's
That
right.
revolution was hijacked. That movement was hijacked by Western powers and their allies. I
That's right.
remember, if you remember, Fred, we received messages. I remember this. We received messages from communists in Syria who said, who asked us for financial support because they said all of a sudden tons of money was coming in and all of it was going through the Islamic organizations who refused to give any to the communists. That to me sounds like that is how you hijack a revolution or a
Yeah,
movement if the movement is not aware of where things are going.
that's right. It was promoted to cut across the Arab Spring,
Yes.
and you know we've seen it. We've seen it several times. The ruling classes would rather civil war and barbarism than the people gaining their actual rights and coming to power.
Exactly.
They will use any means necessary and plunge countries into terrible internal conflict if it
Yes.
maintains their influence, their power over a region. I was reading
Yeah.
one little item, for instance, the foreign fighters that have been involved in Syria, a lot of these extreme Islamists. Well, some of them have been promoted to top army officers in the new army that's being built in
Yeah.
Syria. And people are saying that is of some concern to those who thought, oh, he's cleaning up his image, so he's not the
Yes, of
same as
course.
before. But they're promoting these people,
Clearly not
and
so much a Syrian inclusive national regime. It's
yeah,
inclusive of all the
inclusive,
Islamists throughout
inclusive
the world.
of who.
Yeah.
It's quite clear that he's treading carefully at this moment in time because first of all he doesn't control the whole country. Very far from controlling the whole country. He controls a significant section, but nearly a quarter of the country is under the Kurds. Then you have the Druses in the south. You have the Alawites. You have areas controlled by ISIS still. You have areas controlled directly by the Turks. This is very far from being a government that governs the whole of Syria and creates a new Syria for everybody, etc. Even on the question of democracy, you saw that he announced that it will take 4 years before they can have an election, and I don't know how many years it would take to formulate a constitution. So, in the short term, no constitution, no elections, just this regime in power. With
We've
it
seen it
comes
before.
Yeah, with it comes all the tendencies, towards reaction. And the West are prettifying it. In the media, they're presenting him as this reform guy. He's not what he was. All of a sudden, they had to do it very quickly, though. I mean, you saw they've had to rush to change their, who they consider terrorists and
Yeah, the
who not.
terrorist lists. Yes.
The terrorists of yesterday have now become the reasonable politicians that we can govern.
Moderate rebels. Yeah.
All of a
Yes.
sudden,
Yeah. No, and but um what was I gonna say? Oh, I interrupted you and then I lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. No, but actually it's not just that they're prettifying it. I think what's interesting is also the role they played in bringing this about. Now, there's an article that we received. I think it was actually by Jorge, who was also a regular on this show, um, from the Telegraph on the 18th of December. It's called The US Prepared Syrian Rebel Group to Help Topple Bashar al-Assad. Now, it was clear to me that the Americans, tacitly at least, was supporting the advances of HTS. But what we see now is that they were far more involved and far more, yeah, involved and complicit in what happened than what was clear in the beginning. If you remember, the Americans came out and said, oh, we don't know what's going on. We don't support anything. We call for calm and we call for peace and all of this stuff. But here's what this article says. It says basically that the Americans had advanced knowledge of this. Um, uh, for weeks before this, not only did they have advanced knowledge, but they prepared. You see, what's little known is that the Americans actually occupy a slice of Syria, which is the border between Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. And there's a base there called Al-Tanf. Now, in that base, they've had several hundred mercenaries, essentially Syrian mercenaries. They call them, what's it called? The Revolutionary Commando Army. And they've used that basically to make it to control or to have influence over the logistic lines for Iranian proxies going between Syria and Iraq, and to maintain a foothold in Syria in general. Now, this base has been rapidly expanded in the weeks before. They interviewed a commander of the Revolutionary Communist, sorry, communist, no, Commando Army, and not quite communist. He said, they didn't tell us how it would happen. We were just told everything is about to change. This is your moment. Either Assad will fall or you will fall. But they didn't say when or where. They just told us to be ready. And then it continues. The article continues. In the weeks before the briefing, the U.S. controlled Al-Tanf base on the border of Iraq. According to Captain Mashadani, the RCA's ranks were swollen by smaller freelance units. Freelance units. That's a nice way of calling it mercenaries, like his, under its command. The RCA's ranks grew from about 800 to as many as 3,000 as a result. So 3,000 commandos. All of them were actually previously, or most of them, as far as I understand, most of them, or if not all of them, were previously trained by British and American special forces. And then they became freelancers. All of the members of the force continued to be armed by the US and to receive their salary of $400 a month, nearly 12 times that what the soldiers in the now defunct Syrian army were paid. Just to remember, an ordinary middle class wage in Syria was probably around 60 to 100 pounds, dollars a month. So these guys would get four times that. As the offensive began, the RCA forces fanned out across the eastern desert, taking control of key roads. They also joined up with the rebel faction in the southern city of Deraa that reached Damascus before the HTS. And then it continues. Captain Mashadani said the RCA and the fighters of HTS, which is led by Syria's interim leader Mohammed al-Jolani, were cooperating and communicating, and communication between the two forces was being coordinated by the Americans at Al-Tanf. So here you have an American army, an American mercenary army. This is not even there's not even a degree of separation that would give them plausible deniability. This is an American mercenary army directly coordinating the onslaught against the Assad regime, against Damascus with the HTS, knowing, this is what they say in the article, they knew that the Assad regime could fall. They were told either Assad falls or you fall, right? And as you said, this shows the level to which the imperialists will go to defend their narrowest interests.
That's right.
That they will drag down an entire country into this barbarism, which it is. Now, Joe Biden, they talk about, I get sick when I hear them talk about the Democrats as these kind of lesser evil, nicer people. Of all the people, Joe Biden is the least one of that. Obama, in fact, was much more intelligent than Joe Biden. He started he participated in the campaign of supporting the Syrian opposition, all the Islamists and so on. But as soon as he realized where it was going, as soon as the Islamic State cropped up, the Americans, under pressures under Obama's direction, changed course. They actually stopped funding. The CIA kept funding these people, but the U.S. administration stopped funding the Islamists and threw their weight mainly behind the Kurds. And there was even talk of a de facto alliance, not an alliance in reality with Assad, but as in the Americans just changed their focus and realized that if the Syrian state would collapse, that would be a terrible thing, which would create a level of barbarism the same it's at the state as the similar to what we saw in Iraq and later on Libya and so on and so forth. So Obama realized that you are playing with fire, even from a point of view of U.S. imperialism. They're playing with fire, but these guys, they just went along with it. They just went along with it without asking any questions, without putting any stop. They could have stopped this. They could have moderated it. They could have stopped it. They could have, and as far as I understand, Assad was even in negotiations with the West about potentially making a deal and so on. But they went ahead, and now what we have is a barbaric situation.
Yes. Well, if you remember, where the US originally, in the Western intervention in both Syria and Libya after 2011, wherever the imperialists intervene, and they intervene behind the mask of spreading democracy and human rights, that kind of thing, and in Libya
Yes.
and in Syria, you look at it, wherever they intervene, the final result is a breakdown the state itself becomes a failed state. The breakup along ethnic lines, civil war, barbarism, and a terrible suffering of the millions of ordinary people in these countries. They made a big mess and failed to sort it out. It was actually the Russians who went in, Putin who went in. He went in obviously to back up Assad. That for a period at least seemed to stabilize the situation. Now it's breaking down again. But I think this is also what you were saying about the Americans getting involved directly is also part of the more global conflict between the imperialist powers, between America and the Russians in particular. And in Syria, they saw their chance to bring
Yes.
down a regime which, was close to Russia, had a certain degree of working with Iran. There wasn't a total alliance there, but there was cooperation. Syria was a way of, channeling weapons and supplies to Hezbollah, etc. This has upset all of that. This is actually a way of hitting the Russians and hitting the Iranians in the region,
Of course.
and that is more important to them than the lives of millions of people living in a country like Syria. By the way, on top of the commandos you were talking about, the mercenaries, it's been confirmed that the US has actually got 2,000 troops, US Army troops, on the ground in Syria. They were saying it was 900, and the recent figure says 2,000. They're based in the territory of the Kurds, obviously, but they're there. They're on the ground with both mercenaries and their own troops.
Yeah, and also I just want to add to that not only did they thrown the country into this situation, this chaotic situation, but their ally Israel has also made sure that it remains chaotic, because what the Israelis did immediately after, first of all, they went in and they took a sliver. They just annexed a sliver of Syria, mainly a bit that goes on the border to Lebanon towards Damascus. The reports now are that they are between 20 and 30 kilometers from Damascus, and they've occupied the highest mountain of Syria overlooking the city.
Just a little detail. The land they've occupied, it's a strip. They call it a
Yes.
buffer zone. Basically,
Yeah.
they need a buffer zone to protect what they have illegally occupied in the Golan Heights.
Which they said was a buffer zone.
Yeah. But
The Golan Heights was supposed to be a buffer zone.
although remember that Trump recognized Golan Heights as part of Israel
Yeah.
last time he was in office.
Yeah.
But the amount of land they've occupied, I read somewhere, is actually bigger than the whole of the Gaza Strip.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. It's quite a lot. Not only that, Netanyahu's come out several times, basically encouraging the Druze to call for assistance, i.e., so that the Israelis could come in and either create a Druze republic or potentially annex it themselves. But more importantly, more devastatingly, they have had, what is it, 350 or 400 raids, air raids, the highest on any foreign country, they say. Although I would have thought Lebanon was, they had more air raids on Lebanon. But basically, they've destroyed more than 70% of the strategic military equipment of the Syrians. Syria had a very, very dense air defense network, one of the highest in the world, actually. It wasn't necessarily the most advanced air defense weapons, but it was very dense. That's gone. Their tanks, their planes, they say chemical weapons. I don't think there's been any evidence of that Syria maintained any chemical weapons after they made an agreement about 10 years ago with Russia. But they bombed anything that's a major kind of weapon
Mm-hmm.
in order to destroy the potential of any state or any power being able to consolidate their position. I.e., they are basing themselves on the idea that Syria must remain fractured. It must. You have in Syria now, you have the HTS. They are the biggest force in the West, but they are not big enough to dominate everyone. There's
No.
still old Alawite militias. Even in the north, you have direct Turkish proxies. Then you have the Druze militias. Then in the south, in Dara, as far as I understand, there are separate Syrian militias that also taken over their own areas. Then you have these American mercenaries who've taken a big chunk out of the southeast. Then you have ISIS, and then you have the Kurds that we're going to talk about in a minute. That is a recipe for disaster, for civil war. And what they're doing is actually guaranteeing that. What we're seeing is they're preparing a situation like Iraq and Libya, which could be like a festering wound for years and decades, throwing up things like ISIS and like other things that we've seen.
Well,
And yeah, go ahead.
I was reading an item about, I think it was yesterday, these last few days. Jelani's forces tried to go into the Druze territory in the south. They were blocked by the Druze militias, told they couldn't come in, which is it's a little example of the problems he's going to be facing. Those areas which are controlled by the Druzes with their armed militias, they're not going to easily give up their guns to somebody like Jelani. How can they trust these people? So the Druzes will be armed, and they'll be controlling their area. By the way, that there's 150,000 Druzes in Israel who are citizens of Israel.
Yeah. Yes.
And they got close connections. I even read one maybe an exaggeration, where they were even some of them were even calling for annexation to Israel, that they want to be part of Israel. So that shows you.
Although that was denied by, there was one
Yeah,
man.
yeah.
It was denied by that
The
man's
idea
village.
itself is crazy, but it gives you an idea how difficult it is going to be to unite this country with all these different forces armed
On a sectarian and
yes, right.
religious basis.
Right.
That's the point.
That's right.
That's the whole
So
point. Yeah, I mean, just to end it up here, because we don't have much time, but we'll have to come back to this. I think that is the point, that what we really see in Syria is a complete dead end of capitalism. On the one hand, we see the role of imperialism. It was the Americans at every step. It was American imperialism which laid the basis for this, from the sanctions on Syria, which has destroyed the fabric of life, to supporting all of these jihadi militias, to their complicity and their letting this whole thing happen, to Israel now destroying whatever could have been salvaged by some form of state apparatus. They're sowing instability and barbarism on an unimaginable scale. But I think it also shows something else that we must also say is, you see, in Syria, the Americans were defeated. They were defeated, you can say, by the national bourgeoisie, by the Syrian capitalists, supported by Russia for their own, for their own benefits, not for any, reasons other than that. But they were supported by Russia and Iraq. But nevertheless, the Syrian capitalist class won against the imperialists. And what did they do? They didn't manage to solve anything. They didn't manage to solve anything. They could only, in fact, the the laws of the system itself spurred them on to more stealing, more looting, more exploitation, because that was the best way and they could profit. Because that's what the name of the game is for capitalism.
Right.
And therefore, their rule in all of these years prepared the way for this. That's what prepared the way for a swing back towards the imperialists. And that, I think, that really shows the dilemma for the masses in the Middle East is socialism or barbarism. There's no in between. The idea that Russia or Iran, or, there's some people who have this idea that they will solve this situation. They can come and beat. Yes, they can beat the Americans. That's fine. That's all good. They cannot solve any of the problems, and they do not have the interests of the Middle Eastern masses at heart. They have the interests of their own capitalist classes at heart,
Well,
and
look,
therefore,
yeah,
that's the only way.
if you're talking about capitalism, I wrote quite a long article about the nature of the Assad regime and the process it had gone through. A lot of privatizations. You talk about the capitalist class. The capitalist class of Syria was made up of many officials who came from within the regime, some of them close family ties to the Assad family itself, taking over what was formerly publicly owned resources of the country. So you had this capitalism, which had already been introduced. On the back of the crisis of the system, you had the movement in 2011, and then we can't go into the details how that very quickly dissipated and was taken over by reaction. But even the solution that the Russians provided didn't unite the country. It didn't bring the whole country together. It kind of froze the situation for a period. One area controlled by the Kurds, another one controlled by HTS itself up in the north, the Druzes. The country was like a patchwork of different regions with different militias and a kind of stalemate position. But at the same time, the regime was rotting from within on a capitalist basis. Now, what's interesting is they're talking about this guy, Jelani, coming in and he's looking at neoliberal policies, i.e.,
Yes.
i.e.,
Privatization.
the same system. Now, if you look, I was looking at the figures, something like 60% of the population in the north of Syria, for instance, are in debt, massively in debt, and they can't pay those debts. And the reason they're in debt is they're borrowing to buy food. They're selling bits of household goods to survive. There's power cuts. It's an absolute disaster economically and socially. And what does he propose? Capitalism to continue, but you can bet your bottom dollar that it would be Turkish capital, American capital, and from other countries, and basically exploit the country for the benefit of this or that imperialist country and their hangers-on, their local bourgeois agents. Sometimes the faces can change, the names can change, but the economic structure remains the same. And it's the poor people of Syria who suffer the consequences of this. And it will continue so long as capitalism remains in Syria and in the region.
Yes, exactly. We have to move on because we are low on time. As always, we're rushing rushing for time.
Yeah.
But as I said, we will come back to all of these things and how do you say, like fill out the gaps of the picture over the next weeks and months. The next bit also connected to this, part of this, but process in its own right, is the question of the Kurds, because we had, as we talked about before, after the Syrian revolution, the Kurdish enclave, the Kurdish organization linked to the PKK, which is a leftist Turkish organization, ended up de facto taking power in northeastern Syria and setting up a government, an army, a militia based on Kurdish people, and they became very, very important fighters against ISIS. In fact, they were the most efficient fighters against ISIS. There's a whole thing we can go into about what made them very, very good fighters. But what essentially happened was that the Americans, in order to help stabilize the Middle East, which was running out of control at that point, they realized they need to support the Kurds, which is where they have the 2,000 soldiers that you just talked about, in order to fight ISIS. Now, that has brought them into conflict with Erdogan in Turkey, which sees the Kurds as an existential threat to the Turkish state, because there's a big Kurdish minority in Turkey, and he does not want them to have the idea that they can gain some sort of independence or national autonomous rights of any sort. Now, since the fall of the Assad regime, Erdogan has made it absolutely clear that he will not accept this situation to continue with the Kurds. He's basically hinted that he'll make a deal with Trump. That's what a lot of people have hinted. He'll make a deal with Trump. The Kurds have got to go. They cannot maintain power. They cannot maintain institutional power in Syria. They cannot have a standing army, which they have. I think they have about 100,000 men under arms. And immediately they attacked the city of Manbij, which is a Kurdish city. First of all, there was Kurdish enclaves in north of Aleppo, which were wiped out immediately. The people were driven out peacefully, but under threat, obviously, under threat of arms. And then there was an attack on Manbij, and there's been a war basically being fought for Manbij since then. I'm not sure how that's played out yet, but as far as I know, that's still going on. Now, the situation is that what are the Kurds going to do in this situation? This Barbara Leaf, the person who went to visit Jolani, said that the Americans are in touch with Ankara and the SDF to find a managed transition in terms of SDF's role in that part of the country. The SDF is the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the Kurdish-controlled forces. I.e., there's negotiations clearly taking place about the role of the Kurds.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the BBC asked al-Jolani what he thinks of the Kurds. He is obviously much closer to Turkey than the Kurds. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the Kurds. He said, that they're part of our people and that there should be no division in Syria, and adding that arms should be entirely in the state's hands. He's talking about a disarming of the Kurds.
That's right.
And then he said, we do not accept that Syrian lands threaten and destabilize Turkey or other places. I.e., he is de facto giving in. It seems to he wants to give it, or he is on the side of Turkey in all of this.
Yes.
And yet the situation you have is that the Kurds are insisting on negotiating with HTS. Not only HTS, we'll get to, but negotiate. They actually sent a delegation to negotiate.
Yes.
I have a quote here by Mazlum Abdi, who's a commander. I think he's the main commander of the SDF. He said, well, sorry, no, that's not religious. But anyway, they went there and they negotiated in good faith. Not only that, they also sent messages that they want to negotiate with Israel. There's been a series of messages coming out that it's in Israel's interest to support the Kurds against Turkey. So here you have this Kurdish movement, which is a progressive movement, is supported by millions of leftists all around the world. Kurdish people all over the Kurdish area support them on the basis of them being a left-wing socialist revolutionary movement. That's what they see them as a revolutionary liberationary movement. And yet the leadership insists, one, on having an alliance with the Americans, American imperialism, the most reactionary power on the planet, opening negotiations with the jihadis in charge of Syria now, and appealing of all of the powers that you could appeal to Israel. And this is what they say about the U.S. They said, we do want that the U.S. plays a role in the political process in Syria, also because at the end of the day, we still have some concerns that some radical players in Syria may try to control power. We hope that the incoming administration back in D.C. will help the Syrians. That's the Trump administration they're appealing to. will
Mhm.
help the Syrians to get a Syria that's representing everybody. We're already working and having good relations with the incoming administration in Syria, and we are going to keep up these strong and good relationships.
Yes. Well, they were. I was reading. I think it was even yesterday. There was a report. A delegation of the Kurds went to discuss with Jolani.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see the game that's being played out here because Jolani says he wants to integrate the Kurdish security forces into a national army. That means they'd be under the discipline of a centralized army command. They'd
So
give
they'd
up,
be disarmed.
yeah, they'd give up being an independent Kurdish armed force. But one of the conditions was you must break all links with the PKK. We're not
Yes.
having any PKK operations in Syria. That's clearly an attempt to say to the Turks, we can bring the Kurds under control. We remove their links with the PKK and all the rest of it. But that's the wording of the discussion they had apparently. But
Yes.
it basically what we're looking at here is the real danger that um, the Kurds are going to lose what they fought for all these years. They were seen, as you said, as this progressive left, the Rojava project, the experiment, as they called it. But the problem is this: it's isolated, has been isolated on all sides. Even the Kurds in Iraq, under the leadership of Barzani, those people, they have no interest in supporting the Kurds of Syria. They're too left. They're too progressive for them, for their tastes. But they're isolated. They've been under attack from the Turks. There is economic difficulties in the region. The reading I was looking at is people are struggling to survive even in that region, and in a de facto alliance with the US. The United States have merely been using them. I read one comment that talked about, a tactical temporary alliance of the Americans with the Kurds of Rojava. And that is what it was. It was like, we can use them because they're good fighters against ISIS and all the rest of it. But they're not. The US is not interested in the project of the Kurds. And what's more important to them is their NATO ally, Turkey. No matter what differences they have, they're not going to sacrifice the alliance with Turkey to promote the Rojava project. Can you imagine US imperialism protecting and nurturing some kind of left experiment, as some people have called it? You can't have socialism in one country. You can't have socialism in one region of one country. And there's not even been an attempt to move in a socialist direction in the sense of expropriating capital. What they're doing is cooperatives, small business, this kind of thing. But the end result of this will be, yet again, the Kurds being used by this imperialist power or that power. When it suits their interests, they will use a people. And when they no longer serve their purposes, they will abandon them to their fate. And they are promoting now Jolani. He's the guy. And
Yes.
anything the Kurds want to do will be, the Americans will push them to abandon their position. I was looking at one
See
interview
how enthusiastically they're promoting Jolani
yeah,
compared to the Kurds.
yes, but a commander of the the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces. I'm quoting him. He's referring to the United States. He says this: they, that is the United States, are doing their best to resolve this matter through dialogue. We are thankful for these efforts. They're thanking the American imperialists for the maneuvers that they're carrying out in the region. It's tragic because Rojava was seen as a beacon of something progressive, a genuine alternative in the region. But because even the Kurds themselves have not gone over that line which says, right, we are for the expropriation of capital, we are for genuine socialism. They could have been a point of reference for that throughout the whole of Syria and beyond, in Turkey, in Iraq, in Iran, where all the Kurds are based. They could have been that. Instead, they went for this so-called democratic federalism, whatever it is, of al-Sham, which basically means you have your local administrations, your local communes. I was reading one report that showed that the people are not participating in those communes like they did before. The enthusiasm has gone down. There's an element of demoralization even because of the economic situation, and two, they sense that this project could be coming towards an end, in the sense that the Turks are attacking, the Americans will betray them, the government in Damascus will try and dismantle their forces. This is what they're looking at, rather than a positive perspective.
Yeah, I want to add that there's a one of the viewers has written that the Kurds needed to have the backing of the U.S. in order to survive, and of course, as communists, we're not saying that you can't receive help from any power when it comes to survival. It's not a principal thing. But the question is how you tie yourself to the interests of that power. Now, when the Kurds rose, there was a very widespread ferment throughout the whole region. Massive class struggles everywhere, in Turkey, in Iraq, in Iran, all over the region. And the Kurds, in the Kurdish areas in Iraq, there was mass movement for independence, and the PKK had huge authority there. Inside of Syria, there was a big movement. In Lebanon, there's been since then revolutionary movement. Everywhere in the region, there's been widespread movements, and the Kurds were extremely well placed to reach out to those. Those movements are the only true allies of the Kurdish people. If the Kurdish people want liberation, it can only be done in alliance with the poor workers and poor of the Middle East, not in an alliance, not by tying themselves to the interests of the most reactionary powers on the planet. Because the point is this: by doing that, they have actually undermined that alliance they could have formed before. Because in the eyes of most of the progressive workers and youth, America is hated. Israel is hated. The jihadis are hated. So they actually, what they've done is not a survival mechanism. It's the opposite. It's counterproductive. And it is an attempt to make deals with bourgeois regimes at the top, rather than with the leaning on the movement of the masses and trusting the power of the working class, which is enormous. And there's been plenty of, in Iran also, there's been plenty of times where they could have reached out and they could have gotten an echo. But they didn't do so because they made agreements with all of these powers that they've allied themselves with, that they wouldn't go beyond the borders of Syria, that they wouldn't, basically they put political and geographical constraints on themselves. Now, we don't have much time, but I just wanted to end on just one thing regarding the Kurds, because for Christmas, I got my partner a copy of Aesop's Fables, a very nice copy, actually. And I was reading through it, and there was a story which I thought was very, very, very good. It says, there was once a horse who used to graze in a meadow which he had all to himself. But one day a stag came into the meadow and said that he had as good a right to feed there as the horse, and moreover chose all the best places for himself. The horse, wishing to be revenged upon his unwelcome visitor, went to a man and asked if he would help him to turn out the stag. Yes, said the man, I will by all means, but I could only do so if you let me put a bridle in your mouth and mount on your back. The horse agreed to this, and the two together very soon turned the stag out of the pasture. But when that was done, the horse found to his dismay that in that man he had got a master for good. Now that is the point. That is the point. You cannot ally yourself with a class enemy. You cannot tie yourself to the interests of a class enemy, least of all the most reactionary force that has ever existed on this planet.
That's right.
And in particular in the Middle East, where that force has done that much damage.
Can I just say
Now,
one brief thing?
Yeah.
You see, this is what comes of the so-called pragmatic, practical politics. You give up your long-term interests for a short-term benefit, what seems to be a short-term benefit. Engels made this point in criticizing the right wing of the social democracy in his day, i.e., they think this is what can be done now, and that's what we must do now, ignoring how that can actually have a damaging effect on your long-term interests. It requires having a bit of a Marxist, a dialectical approach to be able to see how what seems the logical thing to do today can actually be very damaging in the future. And if at the end of all this, the Kurdish people are crushed by all these powers, where was the benefit of that so-called practical politics?
Exactly. The proof is in the pudding. Now let's continue to Germany. We have a very good article that I propose everyone to read on Marxist.com. I forgot the title now. I wrote to myself a note to write it down, but I forgot. But I'm sure that our comrades can link the article in the chat. But the basic facts are that the German government has collapsed. There's going to be new elections in February, and there's a deep political and economic crisis. Now, a few days ago, Elon Musk, I can't remember if it was yesterday or the day before, Elon Musk wrote an article in a German paper calling for AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, to be the last spark of hope for Germany. He says basically this is the last hope for Germany. They need to come in, they need to deregulate, they need to... Basically, he threw his weight behind these guys, just like he's thrown his weight behind reform in Britain and Meloni's party in Italy. And this obviously has enraged the German establishment, the political establishment, who dares attack them like this, call them out like this. And it's quite interesting. It's just you read the way that these liberals basically go into a spin over themselves. The co-leader of the SPD, the Social Democracy, Saskia Esken, has said that our democracy is capable of defending itself and it is not for sale. Whoever tries to influence our election from outside, however, supports an anti-democratic, misanthropic party like the AfD should expect fierce resistance from us. So she seems to be quite keen on democracy. But it's quite interesting because the people from her party themselves, along with other people, only 2 months ago, launched a petition in parliament to ban the AfD. How is that for democracy? There's a party that is growing, and the AfD is now the second party in Germany, according to the polls. After the Conservatives, the CDU, which has about 28%, the AfD is polling 18%, and the Social Democrats, who are in government now, have 16%. This is unheard of. And they see this happening, and they think, let's do something really democratic. Let's pass a democratic law to ban these guys. That's basically what they're doing. But all of this, really, the rise of the AfD is connected with a deep crisis of the German economy that we'll touch on in a minute, which is having a big impact on the lives of the working class. I know you had some facts and figures about that, Fred.
Well, yes. The situation in Germany, here are the figures. There are some real serious economic problems. I mean, if you look at GDP growth, it's not just been stagnant, it's been falling. And they're talking about 2 years of contraction of the economy. And it could continue into a third year. Unemployment, which was low, has been creeping upwards. It increased by 0.5% last year. And there's been the loss of purchasing power because of inflation. I just got an article here from earlier this year in The Guardian. The title of the article is German Living Standards Plummeted After Russia Invaded Ukraine, say economists. And then it explains that real wages slumped in 2022 more than in any year since 1950. They're now talking about the 2020s in Germany as a lost decade, economically, socially, etc. And they're in the same article that the intelligent ones, they know it. They say this would further fuel the rise of the AfD in Germany. And there's the same article, it quotes a professor from the University of Massachusetts. He says this: the collapse in living standards experienced by Germans is unprecedented since World War II. And it talks of real wages being 10% below the pre-crisis trend in 2023. This is the situation inside Germany, which explains the political instability. It explains the changes that are taking place. You can't sell words to workers who can't afford to pay their bills. The speeches in Parliament, if it doesn't come with a real policy that actually, puts bread on the table for working class people, then the working class is going to start turning away from you. That's what's been happening in Germany. But there's a more long-term crisis in Germany, which is connected to. There's lots of articles talking about the deindustrialization of Germany. I'm going to quote here from. He's called Martin Vansleben. He's chief executive of the German Chamber of Industry and Commerce, and he says we are not only facing a cyclical but a persistent structural crisis in Germany. He says this was earlier last year. This is that their forecast was that at best the 2024 would end with zero growth, but it actually is slightly down. And he continues. You could quote him at the end. He says, we're seriously concerned about how Germany has become a drag on Europe's economy. We are witnessing a solid structural crisis. And he talks about compounded by geopolitical uncertainties and a decline of domestic and foreign demand. I could go on and on with the figures that they give. But you know what the answer to all this is? Because if you read it, it's about the lowering of investment rates in Germany, the fact that German companies are actually considering their investments are in America, in China, in other parts of the world, but not in Germany. And it's interesting that the same guy that I quoted before, this Chamber of Commerce, he says that back in he says the last time we saw such a situation 20 years ago, during the severe crisis of 2002-23, 2002-2003, that is, sorry. This is a clear alarm signal. And he says, at that time, the government sought to address the crisis with the Agenda 2010 reforms. Let's recall that was a big attack on the rights of the working class, right? We need deep reforms now as well. What does that mean? It means that the answer to the crisis of German capitalism is to further deepen the attacks on the German working class. On top of everything the workers in Germany have suffered in terms of loss in real purchasing power, they're actually complaining that Germany has, in one article I was looking at, they're complaining that Germany has a very developed welfare state, social spending. We can't have that. That's got to go, right? So it means an assault on the working class at all levels. Why? In order to increase the competitivity of German industry, rather than invest capital to increase productivity, because the market isn't there for the goods, it's squeezed the workers. So basically, get more surplus value out of the working class through a direct squeezing of the working class in its condition. Now that is the basis for the instability in Germany today. And the problem we have is, in a situation like this, the so-called left, social democracy and others, they're not presenting an alternative. They're not standing up for the working class. They're not being seen as, we are the guys that defend you and we can sort this out with policies in favor of the working class, which can only be socialist policies, obviously. They try and sort the problem out within the confines of capitalism. And therefore, then suddenly they're surprised that the AfD, almost from nowhere, starts to become a major political force in Germany, and it's quite clearly destined to how do you say, get worse in the next period. This situation,
Yeah.
and it's a recipe for class struggle. But see, the difference here is this: Germany is an economy in decline. Germany is a power in decline, but it's the powerhouse of the European economy. The German, basically, it was German capitalism that held the the European economy together under its domination. Right, that's starting to fragment. You can see it, but the reason is the weakening of Germany. And you can see that in the car industry. Chinese competition is really hitting them hard.
Yeah.
The market isn't there, and this explains the political instability that we have
Yeah.
and the rise of a force like the AfD. But of course, it's
Yes.
not a German phenomenon; it's an international phenomenon.
Yes. In fact, I mean the level of deindustrialization is enormous, is insane actually. According to the German bosses union, I can't remember, they have several, but this one is called BDI. I think it's the main one. Industrial production has fallen by a fifth since 2017. That is a 7-year period. They should have risen. They've fallen by a fifth. And they expect it to fall another 20% in the next period. They, according to the article that we published, that I know that comrades have linked in the chat, there's been 210 billion euros worth of investments in machinery, vehicles, technical equipment, and buildings that have been lost since 2020 in 4 years. That's huge. The whole countries could reinvigorate on the basis of such investments alone, but they've lost that kind of that political that economic basis. And according to a survey by DIHK, 1/3 of all companies and 2/5 of industrial firms are planning to reduce investment in Germany. Now, I started reading for my Christmas reading. I started reading Wolfgang Müncher, which is the horrible liberal ex-Financial Times journalist. I started reading his book called Kaputt. It's about the decline of German industry. I haven't gone all the way through it yet. But it's quite interesting what he actually points out, apart from the liberal holier than thou attitude. Because Germany was an extremely productive country. Extremely productive. I know for a fact that German car plants, the same Volkswagen car plants in Germany, produce 8 times more than Volkswagen car plants elsewhere in the world. Because of the level of expertise, technique, and all of the things that German society and the whole of German industry, which is an organism in itself of different levels of medium and smaller and larger scale companies with extremely high expertise and precision machines and so on. 8 times much compared to Britain. A German worker produces the same in 4 hours that it takes a British worker 5 hours to build. So that's, what is it, 20% more efficient. That's a huge amount in a modern capitalist society. Now, the main reasons behind the growth of German economy in the beginning was after World War II, Germany had mechanics as one of the main they lost a lot of their scientists to the Americans, which meant actually they went to America, the physicists and so on, went and built the transistors and semiconductors, which then became the American IT industry, which America is benefiting from now. Germans had mechanics because they built tanks and machines and cars, and then they had chemicals. And these two industries are basically the only industries that Germany has had ever since. They've been milking them. They haven't developed new industries, but they've been incrementally improving these industries. But nevertheless, in the post-war period, there was huge investments going into, especially the car manufacturing, and again, and chemicals, and you actually, and also to infrastructure generally. The whole of Germany was a very, very advanced country by the end of the 90s. But since then, they basically stopped investments, stopped major long-term investments in the public sector, in the industries. Uh, then, but based since then, they've been milking on that. Basically, the German capitalists thinking, why should we invest more? This is a problem of capitalism. The more you invest, the more the profit rates fall. And but here you could just stop investing and just milk with whatever existing investments you had. And they did everything they could to stop investments in new industries, in new fields, anything that would disrupt this easy money that they were already set up. Everyone knew how it had to be done. And instead, the ways that they managed to increase their competitiveness, which is what they always talk about, is one, as you said, attacks on wages and living standards in the early 2000s. Then the creation of the EU, which created a tariffless market for German goods, right? But then what also happened was that the EU went into a crisis, and the EU, at that point, you had the euro. Now, if Germany had had its own currency at that point, that would have been a lot more worth than the other countries, and it would have been hard for Germany to sell its goods to them. But because it was linked to economies such as France and Greece and Portugal, they actually dragged down, they diluted and dragged down, they depreciated the level of currency of the German currency, which means that Germany could export to China and elsewhere cheaper. Then you had the Chinese market developing, and in particular machine tools that the Chinese were buying from them. And you had cheap gas also starting being set up from Russia. None of these additions to German industry were actually investments in higher tech. There was investment in higher. They had robotics, automation. They're relatively good, but those were not as much. They didn't play as big a role as these external factors is, i.e., just squeezing that old machine more and more and more. That's basically what they've been doing. Now, since then, public sector infrastructure investments have been zero, basically. You go to Germany, everything is falling apart. You're barely, even mobile phone reception is patchy in most places. Research and development has been very, very low, and mainly focused on short-sighted gains, i.e., not in developing something that would give returns in 20 years. Why, when you can have profits in 5, then build something that 20 or 30 or 40 years from now will give you something. And meanwhile, the Chinese market has declined because of the world economic crisis. China has become, that's been compounded by sanctions on China. The EU market has also been hit by the crisis, i.e., they can buy less German goods. Russian gas has been cut off by their own doing, by attacking Russia with Ukraine as a proxy. And meanwhile, China and the Americans, but most importantly China, has actually invested in new industries. Electric cars are now completely outcompeting the old ones, and they're massively gaining in. And that's a different industry altogether. It's not a car industry. It's an entirely different industry that Germany has no basis in, and they did nothing to get that. AI is also a new industry that's developing after many years. And the only countries that are really leading that is China and the US. The Germans has consistently refused to invest in any of these things. Why? Because of the domination of the auto manufacturers, the chemical manufacturers, who wanted all of the added surplus value created in Germany basically just to be funneled through them, and they blocked any other developments. And as you said, the solution now to change all of this, they talk about, yes, we need to have renewable green industries and this and that. In reality, they don't want, the only real solution they have is to just squeeze the working class more. And that's what the problem is, because the FDP, that's what the government crisis came from. The FDP says, let's just go for him. Let's just raise taxes, cut living standards, welfare, everything has got to go. And the CDU and the SCPD and the old auto manufacturers and the unions and so on are saying, wait a minute, if we do this, we're going to end up with a potentially revolutionary or mass social unrest on our hands. And they can't choose. But what I think it really shows is the dead end of capitalism. Here you have the most advanced technology that humanity has ever created. Germany is the most advanced, probably, industrial country in the world on the level of productivity and labor productivity that they can squeeze out of people, or they can provide people. And yet they're shutting down factories. All of this stuff that's needed, you can retool all of these machines for things that are necessary for the human race. They're shutting them down. Millions of people are going to go unemployed. A country is falling apart. Why? Because a small group of people cannot profit from it immediately, right now. That is capitalism. That's the underlying basis for the crisis of German capitalism.
That's right.
Sorry, I went on a long rant there.
No, that's right. I was, they have one of the shortest working weeks, and I've read several articles that point out that this cannot continue.
Yeah.
Looking at incentives to get people to work longer hours. When capitalists revert to that way of increasing their level of competition on a global scale, it shows a weakness, not a strength. Because if you have the investment to increase productivity, is one thing. But if you try and increase it by squeezing the worker, well, there's a limit to what you can do physically with workers. You can't work them into the ground until they die. There's a limit. There's a physical limit, of course, that they are going to go down that road. What we have ahead of us in Germany is years of attacks on the working class, the working week, real wages. They've actually significantly gone down. I remember the days when they would talk about Germany and these high wages and all the rest of it. Well, it's still obviously higher than Greece or Spain or Italy, but it's the direction that they're going in, and we have to look at. And the direction is a lowering of the real wages, which has already taken place. We're at the beginning of that, combined with an attack on all the social gains of the working class in Germany. It is an offensive which is being prepared by the capitalist class. Politically, because of the weakness of the left, it's finding an expression on the right. These populists like the AfD or Le Pen in France or Trump in America or Farage in Britain. I was reading that even in Scotland, reform is picking up support now, which brings home, in Scotland we had the movement for the independence, and the famous words of Lenin when he said, the national question at the end of the day is a question of bread.
Yes.
And it reflects the malaise within society, people looking for a way out of the crisis they're in. And that gave a rise, to the phenomenon of pro-independence in Scotland. They failed. The SNP have failed. The reform is not taking over, but it's picking up, even in Scotland. And there was a big polemic in the last few days in Britain between the leader, Farage, and the new Tory leader, Badenoch, over who has more members. Farage is claiming that he has more members than the Tory party. Probably true, actually. But why is it everywhere we're seeing these people? I was talking to an American friend, non-political, just ordinary working class, and asked me, what do you think of our new president? And I explained, what I thought. And she said, Harris, she promised nothing. What we had under Biden and Harris was inflation, all the prices going up, right? Whereas Trump, he's made promises. He's promised us that he's going to sort things out. And to the point where in 6 months' time, you'll see things getting better in America. That is an opinion amongst a certain layer of the population. They're looking for answers to these real problems that they're facing, the problems of inflation, the problems of housing, rent, the skyrocketing rent, or all the rest of the state of the healthcare, etc. But I would add, there's a mirror image to this process. Let's call it on the right, or populist, or whatever you want to call it, the Farage type phenomenon, the Trump type phenomenon, which has picked up a significant level of support amongst ordinary working class people. But will they be able to deliver? That's the point. On a capitalist basis, they will not. The program of the bourgeois, we've said it in Germany and other countries, the program of the bourgeois is to increase productivity by squeezing the working class more, by getting
Yeah.
more hours of work, by getting more surplus value out of them, which will mean adding pressure to working class, which is already under immense pressure, and they won't be able to solve the problems. Now, what does that mean? Because the question is this: is society going to the right or to the left? It would be a bit simplistic just simply to see it in terms of left, right. This question, and what we need to look at is what is the working class looking for? What problems are they asking to be solved?
Yes.
They're asking
Um,
for jobs that pay decent wages. They're asking for affordable housing. They're asking for decent healthcare. They're asking for the roads to be repaired. When I was reading about Germany, you were referring to it. The level of disrepair of a lot
yeah.
of the roads, the public transport, everybody talks about it. They need to spend a lot of money on that. They're not prepared to do it. The people who have to pay
Exactly.
are the people at the bottom of society. And that has been reflected internationally with this shift. Now, the bourgeois media, The Economist, and others talk about this shift to the right. But I think we referred to it before. You know what happened in America with this Luigi Mangione, and the right wing tried to use it to attack the left, saying the left are gloating over the killing of a CEO. And right wing people saying, I'm a conservative, I'm on the left. I've quoted this before, and they say this is not a left right thing. This is a class thing. And I think
Exactly.
it is a class. It is a class question.
Yeah.
It's the lack of leadership of the working class. It's the degenerate leadership of the working class. People like Starmer that create room on the right for these populists to emerge. But remember, in Britain, Starmer won on the back of people fed up with the Tories, and they thought anything is better than the Tories.
Yes.
Now the mood has changed very, very quickly. The popularity of Starmer has plummeted, and Farage is growing in support. This is something we're seeing, in France with Le Pen. We saw it
Im-
previously with Meloni, all the rest of it. All of that is
Yeah.
happening. But there's another side. The Luigi Mangione thing, what did it show? It showed tremendous class anger. When 40% of the youth of America in opinion polls express some degree of sympathy for what Luigi Mangione did, I think it really highlights what we've been saying in the RCI. There is a layer out there, a layer of, especially amongst the youth, which has drawn quite radical and even revolutionary conclusions from the situation. The problem is there isn't the party that is a point of reference that can channel all of that anger. The task is to channel it into the formation of a party that can
Yeah.
be that mass point of reference for the workers, that can explain to them the answers you're looking for are not to be found in Farage or even in Trump. They're to be found in a revolutionary transformation of society. You want better healthcare? You got to expropriate in America all the healthcare companies, and go even beyond that, expropriate all the big monopolies. That is what's missing. Let's call it from the
Yeah.
debate, as they call it.
Yeah. And I would say, I mean, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal, which is called "The Progressive Moment in Global Politics is Over." It's a bit misleading if you have to understand what they mean by progressive, but it's actually making the same point that the economic situation and the rejection of the whole establishment is leading to the downfall of one establishment party after another.
That's
And it
right.
says part of this shift, it talks about reform, the AFT, all of these things. As part of this shift is the normal pendulum of politics swinging back and forth between establishment party on the left and right. The difference this time is a strong strain of populism and growing rejection of traditional parties. In country after country, many working class voters, and note that, I mean, throughout this article, they just throw around the word working class like it's nothing. This would never have happened 5 or 10 years ago. In country after country, many working class voters, especially those outside the biggest cities, are signaling the same thing. They mistrust the establishment, from academics to bankers to traditional politicians, and feel these elites are out of touch and don't care about people like them. And it goes on, and it actually goes into many of these things. It doesn't obviously draw all of the conclusions that we do, but the underlying situation is the same. Is clear. All of this talk by the liberals that, oh, we are not communicating our message correctly, people don't understand what we're really saying, and Farage and Trump and the AFD are just manipulating people and this and that. In reality, what we have is this: there's mass rejection and anger. There's a revolutionary anger underneath the surface. But what's interesting is this, and that's the main problem. On the one hand, you have a crisis of the system, radicalization of the working class, the workers prepared to take steps forward, and the working class being extremely strong. That's why they cannot carry out the attacks that they want to. They want to carry out very vicious attacks, but they can't. In Germany, that's where the part of the government crisis comes from, because a part of the ruling class realizes if we do what we need to, this is going to create a backlash. So you have the potential of the working class on the other hand, and then you have the abysmal state of the left on the other, the so-called left and social democrats, and even those who call themselves communists, who don't even don't even use the word working class, don't even understand what's actually stirring in the working class, because it's not a clean movement, a clean process, that workers coming on the streets with red banners and calling for socialist revolution, because some of them in a confused way support Trump even, or Le Pen, or other people. Then they don't see them, they reject them. And you have the left either rejecting everything and just being on the side, being pessimistic and depressed, or throwing their weight behind the establishment. This is what the Die Linke in Germany. Why is it that Die Linke is not benefiting from this? Because they've participated in cuts and attacks against workers for decades. They haven't put up a real opposition. Or Bernie Sanders in the US. Well, he capitulated to the Democratic Party, the Labour Party, all of these people. That is the fundamental contradiction we talked about so many times.
What you said when you were quoting that article?
Yes.
What struck me was when the establishment parties of the left and the right,
yes.
i.e., basically what they're saying is,
yes,
system which we used to govern society for decades, in which you had a formerly left party and a right party. In Britain, Labour and the Tories. In America, it was the Democrats and the Republicans, and who play the game of pretending to be alternative to each other. But working class people see that whoever comes into government ends up doing the same. That system, that's the point. That system has broken down. It doesn't work anymore. And the reason being is it's the underlying crisis of the system. It's not the intentions of Starmer or Baden or Gunnar. It's not how bad this one or that one is. It's the underlying system. The huge amount of debt that has been accumulated. The way they solved the crisis in the past was through massive credit, public spending, etc. That debt has built up to a point where it's unsustainable. And the establishment politicians, they will tell people what we need to cut, austerity, privatization, working conditions. Basically, they tell the working class what the working class does not want to hear. And that means the working class won't vote for them. And that suddenly you see these mighty parties of the past collapsing. And apparently small forces suddenly becoming front stage political parties, like Meloni in Italy, from the 4% to whatever, Le Pen, and or the AFD in Germany. All of these have emerged. Why? You see, because these populists, they actually promised the working class they're going to sort things out. They're telling them, look, we can bring back your great jobs, your wages. We can go back to the good old days of the past. And they pick up the votes. There's a contradiction here. what the bourgeois needs and has to be done for their system, and what these politicians are promising. The promises cannot be maintained on the basis of the crisis of the system. We've seen Meloni in Italy has been bent to the needs of the system, and something similar will happen to various populists that are emerging in Europe. And all the promises they've been making, which at the moment means they're riding high in the opinion polls and in the elections. As Marxists, we don't talking about Happy New Year. We don't get depressed. We don't say it's going to be an unhappy new year or whatever because of all this. What we say is analyze why this is happening, what's behind it. And behind it is the fundamental crisis of the system. It's reached its limits. It's now going into reverse. It's no longer taking society forward. In actual fact, it's taking it backwards. Earlier, we spoke about the Middle East, the barbarism that they're prepared to push society into is an indication of the same crisis, the same impasse of the system. What's being prepared as a consequence of this is another backlash. At the moment, they're talking about a backlash, against the establishment parties, Trump exploiting that, Le Pen exploiting it, the AfD exploiting it. The working class has to go to the school of these people, unfortunately. But the working class does learn. It learns from living experience, and it draws conclusions from this experience. That will be the next phase once these populists have been put to the test. That's what Marxists prepare for. And it's with that understanding that we have confidence that we can build a strong revolutionary communist organization inside the working class. In that sense, it could be a happy new year. In what sense? More people join the revolutionary communists and we get stronger. Our message gets to a wider layer. We pick up the angry youth, the radicalized workers, and start to organize them into a bigger force. That's what's worth doing.
Yes, absolutely, Fred. I think that's the right note to end on. I think one of our viewers has written that sometimes being depressed is better than doing things half-assedly. I think that you will find that if you come to the Revolutionary Communist International, you will not find anyone who's depressed, and you will not find anyone who does anything in a half-assed manner. Because, in fact, yes, there's plenty of horrors taking place in capitalism. But as Lenin said, capitalism is horror without end. That is the nature of the regime. But what we have today is precisely that the system is going into a crisis. And in one country after another, the class struggle is beginning to accelerate and the working class beginning to move. And layers of the youth and layers of the workers moving even towards communism. In fact, I would say that probably since the end of World War II, it's never been easier being a communist, being a revolutionary communist. It's never been easier than it is today. Now, what we do is precisely to build an organization internationally in every single country of the world, or as many as possible, that can become that point of reference once the class struggle begins to move, as Fred explained. And if you want to join the Revolutionary Communist International, or if you want to hear more, write to us on marxist.com/join us. I think there will be a link in the chat, and come to one of our meetings. We organize in total in around 70, maybe even more countries. We have sections and groups in 40 different countries. And so there's plenty, there should be one near you. And if not, you can maybe help us build one. With those words, I think we'll call it today, and we'll be back again next Thursday, 3 p.m. London time, as per usual. Thank you very much, Fred.
Okay.